Hi, this is Gus Lefkowski for AP Gov, and in this video we're going to be looking at the Declaration of Independence as well as the Articles of Confederation, which of course are going to lead us into the Constitution. So, with that said, here is our learning objective, and there is that term that we saw in the video with respect to Enlightenment thought, popular sovereignty, basically the will of the people should prevail, that they have the right to govern, and of course that comes from none other than Rousseau. So, origins of the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence is mentioned in the AP Gov curriculum, but I don't think it's going to be a huge document to focus on. Certainly it's important in the sense that it's going to formally break away from Great Britain. And to what extent it is a foundational document, I sort of waver in between, only because simply the Declaration of Independence is just breaking up with Great Britain. Now, certainly it's going to set some ideals there, especially with Locke, with respect to natural rights, with respect to consent of the governed. Certainly those are important parts. But I think the real big takeaway here is that it's going to lay down the foundation, I guess, for the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution to make its way. So, just a little bit of background on the Declaration of Independence, right? The Continental Congress is listing the grievances against the British, and in many ways this is a verbal attack in announcing and justifying the revolution. If you read the document, which you definitely should be, because the AP Gov has listed it as a foundational document, you'll see that you have your introduction, he's sort of setting the stage, and then lists a number of grievances, followed by the formal breakup led by none other than Thomas Jefferson. So quite an important document in that sense, but keep in mind that AP Gov is more concerned about the government aspect of this and political aspect of this than the historical aspects. That's something you would be more concerned in AP US. AP Gov, we're just looking at the foundation and how it relates to the American governmental system. So when we talk about Locke with respect to the Enlightenment, certainly you see a lot of what he has stated, from natural rights to the purpose of government, equality, etc. These phrases that he wrote are very much translated. I mean, they might be phrased a little bit differently, but at the end of the day, in many ways, these thoughts are taken directly from the Enlightenment, and that is the importance right there of the Enlightenment. Also, you have the idea of a limited government, that you're not going to have the rule of one or two or three, you're going to have the rule of many. And of course, there's that right to revolt that he's very much famous for as well. So that is what I would be very much concerned about. At the end of the day, with the American Revolutionary War, right, the colonies, of course, prevail. But at the end of the day, this is considered generally a conservative revolution, right? The idea here of this is a very much political revolution. Ultimately, when you look at other revolutions that have occurred throughout history, they tend to be because of economic reasons or slave-type reasons. That was not the case in the colonies. Really, the case was the colonists felt that they had unalienable rights. They were not being represented, hence no taxation without representation. And they felt really that they were justified in that. At the end of the day, this is a very conservative revolution, as there are not going to be major changes of lifestyle. You look around before the revolution and after, life really hasn't changed so much for you. So, in comes America's first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, right? And it establishes this confederation, which is a league of friendship and perpetual union among 13 states and former colonies. The problem here, and it's very much understandable, the colonists devised this type of government where all the power is situated in the hands of the states. They were afraid of a strong central government, like they had with Great Britain. So they did not want to give up all this power to a strong central government because they were afraid that the same thing was going to happen. It's almost like if you get out of a bad relationship for whatever reason, and you just don't go into that relationship anymore because you're like, that didn't work for me one time, so I'm done with it. And that's sort of the mindset that's going to prevail. But certainly there are going to be a lot of issues here, namely, the government now is going to lack a centralized military power, so there's no national power at all. They also lack the ability to collect taxes, and they also have a number of other problems here. Look at some of these weaknesses. As we said, Congress has no power to regulate interstate. Congress has no power to enforce its own laws. If you want to enact a law, you need 9 out of the 13 states to do that. Imagine how difficult that would be, especially when you consider the regional differences between the northern, middle, and southern colonies. Not to mention, you do not have an executive branch, and you do not even have a national court system. There are so many problems with this. Certainly, again, it is understandable as to why you devised the Articles of Confederation, but in reality, it just isn't going to work. Look at the outcome here, right? There are problems with each of these aspects of the Articles of Confederation. You sort of read this document, and I very much encourage you to read this, because it's almost laughable thinking of this in the 21st century. But again, think about this. Post-American Revolutionary War, it makes sense. But in practice, it's not going to work. And what exposes that most is, of course, Shays' Rebellion, right? Where you're going to have these debt-ridden farmers who ultimately are going to be led by Daniel Shay, who leads these series of attacks on courthouses by these bands of farmers. And certainly this becomes problematic. This highlights the inefficiency, the ineffectiveness of the Articles of Confederation, because they can't even put down a small farmer rebellion. And at the end of the day, this becomes very problematic. And the economic elite are very concerned, especially about their own property rights. What might happen next? So this is sort of a wake-up call that, whoa, something needs to be done. And this is what's going to, of course, lead into the U.S. Constitution. Because think of the U.S. Constitution as a fix for all of these issues. When you look at the Constitution that's going to be devised, the one that we have today, it addresses many of these issues in a much more effective manner. So Shays' Rebellion certainly is that pivotal event. Now, moving into the Constitution and the drafting and the ratification, here are some of the learning objectives that are going to be met right here. So a constitutional convention is, of course, going to be held in Philadelphia. 55 men from 12 out of the 13 states. Yes, you do have the great state of Rhode Island boycotting. And when you look at the makeup of these 55 men, most were college graduates with some political experience. Many were coastal residents from larger cities, not the rural areas. So in many ways, you can, if you were to hypothetically apply one of the representative forms of democracy here, you might be more inclined to utilize elite theory, as many of them, most people were not college graduates at that time by any means. So again, this is going to be setting up sort of a separation of two different factions that will eventually be the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists that, of course, are going to emerge. So as I just asked you before, which view of American democracy does it support? Undoubtedly the elite theory here. So, compromise in Philadelphia. There are several different issues that they have to compromise over, and as this picture illustrates, there's a lot of crossing out, there's a lot of filling in, and if you look at some of the original drafts of the Constitution, they are quite interesting, especially when you look at some of the notes made and some of the things stricken out that were eventually going to be included but not. It's very, very fascinating. But of course, you should probably know this from U.S. history, and I don't know how much of this is going to be on it. Some AP teachers don't even teach this part at all, but I figured just to cover our bases here. Of course, you have the New Jersey plan that's going to favor smaller states with equal representation. The counter plan to that is, of course, the Virginia plan, which is population-based. That's how people would be represented upon with the national legislature. So ultimately what happens, we're going to combine these two plans as a result of the Grand Committee, where you have one delegate from each state to settle the differences. And Roger Sherman was certainly very important in this Grand Committee and eventually in brokering what's known as the Connecticut or the Great Compromise, where it takes the best aspects of each of these plans. For example, we now have a House of Representatives that's based on state population, but we also have a Senate that includes 2 members of each state, regardless if your state has 5 people in it or 15 million in it. It does not matter. Everybody gets the same. And of course, we see that in the Senate. And the House, of course, the more people you have, the more representatives you have. So that was the big compromise here. Another compromise here, slavery. What do we do about slavery? Well, how about we don't mention it by word in the Constitution? And this is one of the unresolved issues that, of course, is going to eventually lead to the Civil War, arguably. Now, had they included that slavery would be outlawed, you'd have some issues here, because would the other states, namely in the South, have ratified the Constitution? Probably not. So you come up with the 3/5 compromise in terms of calculating how many people you have. The South is going to say for every 5 slaves, 3 are counted as people. So there's slavery, sort of kicking the can down the road, if you will. And then political equality and voting was left to the states. So ultimately, the states are going to be deciding election laws for that matter. So that's why even today we have some states that say you can have early voter registration or early voting or same-day registration, while others say no, the last day to register is 31 days in advance. And part of that, too, is the Electoral College, where there's a compromise in that each state could decide how electors will be chosen. You see that even today with respect to Maine and Nebraska. They do it in a proportional way. It's not a winner-takes-all system. So states certainly have a lot of control to some extent with respect to elections and voting. Another important aspect of our Constitution is called the Madisonian Model. The Madisonian Model was to prevent a tyranny of the majority. So, of course, none other than Madison is going to be proposing a government consisting of the following: limiting majority control so that not one branch can dominate, separating the powers. We see that, right? For example, the judicial branch makes court rulings. The legislature is in charge of making laws and proposing bills. And then, of course, the executive is the one who's going to be enforcing the laws, implementing policy. So powers are separated and purposely designed so that one branch can't take over another. You also have checks and balances. If the executive is, far reaching its power, then of course the House can impeach, and then the Senate would hold a trial. In a similar manner, if the president thinks that the Congress is overstepping its boundaries with a bill, the president can then, of course, veto that bill. So we do have a system of checks and balances built into the system. And then we have a federal system, which also includes the states in a variety of issues. And when we get into the Bill of Rights, we'll see that clearly, that the states have supreme power when it comes over to issues like elections and schools and dealing with driver's licenses today, right? Those are reserved powers. So sometimes the state's going to work with the national government and vice versa. So we do have a federal system that also includes the states as well. And also with respect to the amendments, Congress can't just pass an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It includes the states as well. So this prevents a tyranny of the majority. And again, this is very important towards preventing one branch from dominating control. So you see that the Electoral College, even with state legislatures, is involved. So there's another example of federal power being utilized there. So even when it comes to nominating judicial appointments, right, that's the president's job, and then the Senate is in charge of confirming that. So you have 3 different branches that are being affected here. So a lot of power built into the variety of branches, as well as giving some power to the states to prevent an overtaking of the government. Ideally, that is. And then, of course, you see the separation of powers and checks and balances here. Those we'll get into in later units. But again, it shows the power of the Madisonian model in its ideal form. All right, so drafting a new constitution. This becomes ultimately a constitutional republic, right? A republic in which this form of government in which the people select representatives that govern them and make laws. In the previous video, we talked about the problems associated with direct democracy. So as a result, it's going to be allowing for voters to select somebody to represent them in their interests like we have today. And ultimately, with our new constitution, change is slow, right? It is very, very slow, and it was not meant to be a knee-jerk reaction anytime people wanted to have something passed or wanted something changed. It's a very slow type of process, which of course brings its advantages and disadvantages. The problem now is, now the Constitution is drafted and approved by the Constitutional Convention, although not unanimously, it has to be ratified. And when we talk about ratification, we're going to be talking specifically about making it legalized. And what is going to make that legal? That's going to involve all 13 colonies. That is very, very important, and that's going to be the next battle for those advocating for this new Constitution.